The room went quiet before I said a word. It wasn't a large room, just a long walnut table, 12 leather chairs, sunlight coming in through tall windows that hadn't been cleaned properly in months. Dust hung in the air like it didn't want to choose a side. My son sat halfway down the table, jacket folded neatly over the back of his chair. He looked confident, relaxed, the way a man looks when he believes the paperwork is already in his favor. Across from him sat Mr. Halpern, Daniel. Halpern had aged since I'd last seen him. Thinner hair, deeper lines around the mouth, but his posture was still straight enough to cut glass. The medals were resting in a small black presentation case in front of him. My medals. I folded my hands and looked at my son. You told me, I said evenly, that they were in storage. He didn't answer right away. His eyes moved from me to the case, then back again. Dad, I explained. Yes, I nodded. You explained. Mr. Halpern opened the case gently. The metal caught the light without apology. Bronze, silver, a quiet ribbon of blue. I purchased these online 3 weeks ago, Halpern said calmly. The seller claimed they came from an estate clearance. My son shifted in his chair. That's standard language. It's not. It included your name, Halpern continued. And your service number. The air changed. I looked at my son the way I used to look at him when he was a boy trying to explain a broken window. You see, I said, my voice steady. The buyer wasn't a stranger. My son's jaw tightened. What is this supposed to mean? It means, I said, that before you decided to sell pieces of my life while I was lying in a hospital bed, you should have asked who might recognize them. Silence again. Then I closed the case myself. But to understand how we got here, I said quietly, you need to know what those medals meant. I've never been a man who needed reminders of who he was. The medals stayed in a cedar box on the top shelf of my bedroom closet for nearly 40 years. Not because I was ashamed of them, and not because I didn't value them. I simply didn't believe memory needed to be polished every day. My late wife, Margaret, used to dust the box when she cleaned. She would hold it in both hands, as if it were made of glass instead of wood, and ask if I wanted it displayed properly. It's not a trophy, I would tell her. It's a receipt. A receipt for what? She'd ask. For the men who didn't come home. She never asked again after that. When Margaret passed 8 years ago, the house grew quieter than I expected. Not hollow, just deliberate. I kept my routines, up at 6. Coffee in the blue ceramic mug she bought at a roadside market in Virginia. The newspaper folded precisely down the middle. A walk around the neighborhood at 9, nodding to the same people, exchanging the same restrained greetings. I wasn't lonely. I had structure. My son, Daniel, lived 40 minutes away in a newer development, with a gate that opened automatically when it recognized his car. He worked in asset management, which I understand to mean that he moves money from one place to another and keeps a percentage for himself. He visited once or twice a month. He always brought something: imported coffee beans, a bottle of wine I wouldn't drink, a new tablet he insisted would make my life easier. He meant well, I think. But there was always an impatience behind it, a sense that I was an unfinished project. You don't have to live like this anymore, Dad, he'd say, looking around the house as though it were a museum exhibit. Like what? I'd ask. So, minimally, I never corrected him. Minimal wasn't the word. Intentional was. He rarely asked about the war. When he was younger, he'd sit cross-legged on the living room rug and ask about the helicopter rides or the desert heat. As he grew older, the questions stopped, replaced by talk of investments and tax brackets. That suited me fine. The hospitalization wasn't dramatic. No sirens, no cinematic collapse. Just a tightness in my chest that lingered longer than it should have. My doctor called it a precautionary admission. We'd rather observe you for a few days, he said. 72 hours. Maybe less. Daniel arrived at the hospital within an hour of my call. Faster than I expected. He stood at the foot of my bed, hands on his hips, scanning the monitors as though he understood them. You should have told me sooner, he said. It's indigestion with paperwork. I replied. He didn't smile. We need to start thinking about contingencies. I remember that word. Contingencies. I'm staying overnight, he continued. I'll handle things at the house. Mail, bills, whatever needs doing. That won't be necessary, I said. It's not a debate, Dad. Let me help. There it was again. Not quite concern. Not quite command. Something in between, I nodded. All right. Over the next 2 days, he came and went with updates. Garage doors sticking. You've got old insurance files in the study. There's a lot of stuff. On the second afternoon, he sat down beside the bed and leaned forward. You ever think about downsizing? He asked casually. I already did, I said. When your mother passed? No, I mean really downsizing. Selling the house. Moving somewhere managed, safer. Safer from what? He hesitated. From being alone. I watched him carefully then. His jaw was set the way it gets when he's preparing an argument. I'm not alone, I said. I have neighbors. I have colleagues. Colleagues? He raised an eyebrow. I sit on 2 advisory boards. I attend meetings. I manage. He blinked, surprised, as if parts of my life existed without his awareness. I just don't want you overwhelmed, he said finally. I'm not overwhelmed. That evening, as he gathered his coat, he added, I found a wooden box in your closet. Old military stuff, I assume. My heartbeat slowed. Yes, I said. You ever think about having it appraised? Sometimes that kind of memorabilia has value. It has value, I replied. Just not the kind you're thinking of. He smiled faintly, the way one humors an outdated opinion. We'll talk about it later. He left shortly after. In the quiet of the hospital room, with the steady rhythm of the heart monitor marking time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not even anger, just the subtle awareness that someone had begun measuring my life in columns and figures, and I wasn't certain when that started. Daniel brought it up again on my 3rd day in the hospital. The cardiologist had just finished explaining that my heart was stubborn, but serviceable. I appreciated that phrasing. It sounded less like a malfunction and more like personality. When we were alone, Daniel closed the door and pulled the visitor's chair closer to my bed. He didn't sit back in it. He perched on the edge, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. I've been thinking, he began. That's usually how these conversations start. I said, he didn't take the bait. You can't keep pretending you're 45. I never was 45, I said. I went from 30 to 60 without noticing. Dad. His tone shifted, softer, but sharpened at the edges. The voice he used with clients who needed convincing. I'm not attacking you. I'm trying to be realistic. About what? About what happens next. I folded my hands over the hospital blanket. What happens next is I go home, argue with the insurance company about this bill, and complain about hospital coffee. That's not a plan. It's worked so far. He inhaled slowly, as if preparing himself for my resistance. I spoke with a colleague of mine, he said, an estate planner. Just preliminarily. I didn't authorize that, I know. I'm just gathering information. There it was again. Information, contingencies, language that reduced a life to bullet points. He mentioned something important, Daniel continued. Temporary power of attorney. Just in case something like this happens again. Something like indigestion. Something like you being unconscious. I wasn't unconscious, you could have been. We held each other's gaze for a long moment. I have a will, I said calmly. You know that. A will isn't enough. It's been enough for generations. He leaned back slightly, frustration flickering across his face. You're missing the point. If something sudden happens, decisions need to be made. Assets managed. Property protected. You can't expect me to navigate all that without authority. I studied him carefully then. When did this become about authority? I asked. It's not about authority, he said quickly. It's about efficiency. That's a business word. It's a practical word. Silence settled between us. Thick, but not hostile. After a moment, he shifted tactics. I was at the house yesterday, he said casually. I opened the cedar box. I didn't react. They're in good condition, he continued. Surprisingly good. Some of those metals, depending on the buyer, could fetch a decent price. They're not for sale. I'm not saying they are. I'm just saying you don't even display them. They're sitting in the dark. They're not meant for display. Why not? His voice carried genuine confusion now. You earned them. That's precisely why. He shook his head. Dad, with respect, they're objects. Metal and ribbon. If they can be converted into something useful, medical security, renovations, long-term care, why wouldn't you at least consider it? Because they weren't metal. Because each one had a name attached to it in my memory. Because one of them was pinned on me by a man who lost 2 fingers in the same week I lost friends. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I said, there are other resources. He frowned slightly. Like what? I've managed my affairs carefully. That house is your primary asset, is it? His eyes narrowed, calculating. Dad, I've seen the accounts. You've seen some accounts. A pause. You think I'm after your money? He said quietly. I think, I replied evenly, that you're in a hurry. For what? I let the question hang. He stood up and walked toward the window, staring out at the parking lot below. I'm trying to protect you, he said finally, from making decisions too late. And I'm trying, I said, to make them in my own time. He turned back toward me. At least let me draft the power of attorney, he pressed. It doesn't mean we use it immediately. It just means we're prepared. Prepared. You're very focused on preparation, I observed. That's what responsible adults do. I gave him a small nod. Draw it up. I'll review it. His shoulders relaxed just slightly. And the medals? He asked almost as an afterthought. They stay where they are, for now. For as long as I decide. He hesitated, then smiled. But it was a thinner smile than usual. Okay, he said. For now. He picked up his coat and adjusted his cufflinks, silver, engraved, expensive. A gift to himself, I suspected. At the door, he paused. You know I'm on your side, he said. I hope so, I replied after he left. I stared at the ceiling for a long time. Concern can sound a great deal like kindness, but sometimes it's just impatience dressed in softer clothes. And for the first time, I began to wonder which one I'd been listening to. Daniel returned the next morning with a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. He didn't mention it right away. We spoke about discharge timelines, about a neighbor who had apparently left his recycling bins out too long, about the nurse who insisted I tried gelatin in a color not found in nature. Then, when the room quieted, he placed the folder on the tray table in front of me. I had something drafted, he said. Of course he did. The paper was thick, professional. Tabs marked with neat adhesive flags. My name printed across the top in clean, confident lettering. This is a limited power of attorney, Daniel explained. Medical and temporary financial authority. It only activates if a physician certifies incapacity. Incapacity, I repeated. It's standard language. I adjusted my glasses and read carefully. I've never signed anything I didn't understand. Not in uniform, not in business, not in marriage. The document was thorough. Broader than he'd implied. This includes property transactions, I said quietly. Only if necessary. Necessary is a flexible word. It's protective, he corrected. For whom? He exhaled, a small thread of impatience slipping through. Dad, you're reading this like it's a trap. I'm reading it like it's binding. He softened his tone again. I'm your only son. If something happens, I'm the one the hospital calls. The bank calls. The county calls. Without this, everything stalls. I looked at him over the top of the page, and you're very uncomfortable with things stalling. He didn't answer that. Instead, he leaned forward. You taught me to be proactive, he said, to anticipate problems before they escalate. I also taught you not to take what isn't offered. His jaw tightened just briefly. This isn't about taking. No, I agreed. It's about control. The word landed between us. For a moment, I saw something flash across his face. Offense, perhaps. Or recognition. Fine, he said after a pause. Let's narrow it further. We can exclude property sales unless 2 physicians sign off. I'm not trying to steamroll you. I studied him carefully. There are moments when a man reveals whether he believes patience is strength or weakness. Daniel had always mistaken it for the latter. Still, I was in a hospital bed. My chart hung at the foot of it like a summary of fragility. Whether I liked it or not, the world moved faster now than it once did. Amend it, I said. Remove unilateral authority over property and personal items. Financial accounts require co-signature from my advisor. He blinked. Your advisor? Yes. You never mention... I don't mention everything. That settled him back in his chair. There's an advisor, he repeated slowly. Yes. He nodded once. Recalibrating, all right, he said. I'll have it revised. Later that afternoon, after he'd stepped out to take a call, my nurse lingered by the doorway. Your son seems very organized, she said carefully. He is. He's been asking the billing office detailed questions. That doesn't surprise me. And he inquired about discharge timing yesterday, specifically whether you might need rehabilitation care. I won't, I said. She gave a polite smile. Of course. When she left, I stared at the folder again. Organized, prepared, efficient. Daniel returned with a revised version before dinner. We reviewed it line by line. The amendments were there, limited, conditional. I signed, not because I trusted him entirely, but because I wanted to see what he would do with the boundaries. As he capped his pen, he seemed almost relieved. This is smart, he said. Now, if anything happens, I can step in immediately. Only within limits, I reminded him. Of course. He slipped the documents back into the folder with careful precision. You rest, he added. I'll swing by the house tonight and make sure everything's squared away. Everything? I asked. Mail, utilities, just housekeeping, I nodded, after he left. I called my attorney, not an alarm, not yet, just to confirm that copies of certain documents remained exactly where I had placed them years. I go trusts, directives, board, agreements they were, when I was discharged. 2 days later, Daniel drove me home himself. He carried my overnight bag, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside ahead of me. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. See? He said lightly. Managed. I stepped into the hallway slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the familiar shadows. Everything looked in place. Everything except something I couldn't yet name. Recovery is a quiet process. There's no applause for walking from the bedroom to the kitchen without pausing. No ceremony for climbing stairs without gripping the railing. Just small victories unannounced. Daniel checked in daily that first week, sometimes in person, sometimes by phone. Take it easy, he would say. I am, I'd reply. He'd begun using phrases like long-term comfort and future planning more frequently. I let them pass. It was 5 days after I returned home that I noticed the closet. Not immediately. I had gone in to retrieve a sweater. The late afternoon air had cooled, and the house, despite Daniel's managing, felt untouched in the ways that matter. The cedar scent was faint, too faint. I looked up at the top shelf. The space where the box had rested for decades was empty, not disturbed, empty. I stood there longer than necessary, my hand still resting on the closet frame. Perhaps Daniel had moved it while cleaning. Perhaps he'd placed it somewhere safer. Logical explanations lined up quickly, efficiently. I walked into the hallway and called him. He answered on the second ring. Hey, Dad, everything okay? Yes, I said evenly. Where's the cedar box from my closet? Brief pause. Oh, that, he replied. I meant to mention it. I'm listening. I had it evaluated. Evaluated. Just to understand its market value. You said you wanted to make informed decisions. I said I wanted to make my own decisions. And you will. I just accelerated the information. Where is it? Another pause. Slightly longer. It's with a collector, he said. Temporarily. Temporarily. He specializes in military memorabilia. Very reputable. I didn't want it sitting in the house unsecured. It's been sitting in the house unsecured for 40 years. Well, he said carefully, circumstances change. I let the silence stretch. You didn't have authority to remove it. I said, I have limited power of attorney. You have conditional authority under medical incapacity. You were hospitalized. I was conscious. His voice tightened. Dad, why are we arguing about this? I'm trying to increase your options. By removing something without my permission, it's not removed, he insisted. It's being appraised. Then give me the collector's name. Another pause. I'll send it over, he said. I'm in the middle of something right now. We ended the call politely, too politely. That evening, I sat in my study and opened my laptop. Daniel had insisted I learn to use it properly last Christmas. You need access, he'd said. He was right. It took less than 15 minutes. The collector's name hadn't arrived by text, but a search of recent online listings under a regional memorabilia exchange site yielded something else, a photograph. Black background. My medals arranged in precise alignment. The blue ribbon unmistakable. The small dent on the bronze star visible in the lower right corner, one I remembered distinctly. The listing read, Estate Clearance. Authentic service medals. Verified documentation included. Seller, D. Whitaker. My son's initials. The price was not an appraisal figure. It was a completed transaction, sold 3 days earlier. I did not feel anger, not at first. I felt something colder, a stillness that settles in before a storm decides whether to arrive. The buyer's name was partially obscured, but not entirely. D. Halpern. The room seemed to tilt slightly, though I was seated. Daniel Halpern. There are names you don't forget. I closed the laptop carefully. On the mantel in the living room sat a photograph taken decades ago. 5 men standing shoulder to shoulder, uniforms pressed, expressions restrained. Daniel Halpern stood to my left in that picture. Younger, unlined, certain. He had been the one to pin one of those medals on my chest. Not because I asked, but because he insisted. I reached for my phone again this time. I did not call my son. I dialed a different number. It rang twice. A familiar voice answered. Halpern speaking. It's Thomas Whitaker, I said quietly. There was a pause on the other end. Then, softer. I was hoping you'd call. I was hoping you'd call. Daniel Halpern's voice hadn't lost its steadiness over the years. If anything, it had deepened. Age does that to some men. It sands away the excess. You recognize them, I said. Immediately. There was no accusation in his tone, only certainty. They came across my desk 3 days ago, he continued. One of our junior board members monitors private sales. He flagged the name before the listing even closed. Our, I repeated. Yes, I hadn't attended a foundation meeting in person since my hospitalization. I'd kept my involvement quiet for decades. Advisory roles, endowment structuring, scholarship oversight. The kind of work that doesn't require photographs. The Whitaker Veterans Legacy Fund bore my name only in its founding documents. Publicly, I was simply listed as a contributing member. I preferred it that way. You purchased them yourself? I asked. I did, Halpern replied. Immediately. Before they could circulate, a pause. I wasn't certain whether to contact you directly, he added. Family matters can be delicate. They can, I agreed. You didn't authorize the sale. No. Another silence. Not uncomfortable. Just waited. I kept them secured, he said. Along with the documentation your son included. Documentation. Service records. Copies of citations. Enough to authenticate beyond doubt. Of course, Daniel would include paperwork. He had always understood presentation. I appreciate your discretion, I said. Tom, Halpern replied gently, using the name only old friends use. These aren't commodities. They're history, and they're attached to a foundation that exists because of what they represent. I'm aware. I assumed you were. He hesitated. There's a board meeting scheduled this Friday, he continued. Quarterly review. Estate allocations are on the agenda. Estate allocations, I repeated. Yes, your son contacted our office last week. That settled it. In what capacity? I asked. He introduced himself as acting under temporary authority. Inquired about your pledged endowment schedule. Asked whether beneficiary designations could be amended. I closed my eyes briefly. And what did you tell him? That changes to the Whitaker Fund require the founder's signature or a majority board vote in the event of incapacity. And that you are neither incapacitated nor silent. I allowed myself the smallest breath of relief. I'd like to attend Friday, I said. You're always welcome. No, I clarified. I'd like my son to attend as well. A measured pause. I see. He believes he's consolidating assets, I said. It would be useful for him to understand the structure. Halpern's voice softened further. You want this handled? Formally, I want it handled. Correctly. I'll arrange it, we ended. The call without ceremony. I sat alone in my study for a long time. Afterward, the house was quiet in the way it had been after. Margaret passed, still observant, as if waiting to see what kind of man I would choose to be next. On the desk beside me sat a leather binder containing the Foundation's original charter. I'd signed it 22 years earlier with the same pen I'd used to sign Daniel's birth certificate. One act created a legacy, the other entrusted one. They are not the same. My phone buzzed. A message from my son. Collector confirmed transfer. Funds will clear tomorrow. We should discuss reinvesting strategically. Reinvesting. I typed a brief response. Let's discuss it Friday. 10 a.m. Whitaker Foundation boardroom. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Why there? Because that's where the medals are. A longer pause this time. Then, okay, I set the phone down. For the first time since leaving the hospital, my pulse felt steady for reasons unrelated to medication. There is a difference between reacting and responding. On Friday, I intended to respond. Friday morning arrived without drama. I dressed carefully. Navy blazer, white shirt, the same cufflinks Margaret had given me on our 30th anniversary. Plain silver, no engraving. I have never favored ornament. The Whitaker Foundation occupies the 3rd floor of an older brick building downtown. No grand signage, just a modest plaque beside the door. Daniel was already in the lobby when I arrived. He stood as I approached. You look well, he said, scanning me quickly, perhaps measuring strength. I am, I replied. He gestured toward the elevator. You didn't mention you were still actively involved here. I didn't mention many things. That earned me a small, uneasy smile. Inside the boardroom, the walnut table gleamed under recessed lighting. Framed photographs lined the walls. Scholarship recipients, rehabilitation programs. Families standing beside folded flags. Moments of quiet rebuilding. 3 board members sat along the far side. They greeted me with nods that carried years of shared work. At the head of the table sat Daniel Halpern. In front of him rested a black presentation case. My son noticed it immediately. His posture stiffened, though he tried to disguise it by adjusting his jacket. Mr. Halpern, he said smoothly, extending his hand. Daniel Whitaker. I'm aware, Halpern replied. Shaking at once, firm, brief, we took our seats. Daniel, my son, placed a slim portfolio on the table. I've reviewed my father's charitable commitments, he began, tone polished. Given recent health events, I believe it's prudent to reassess liquidity and future distributions. Future distributions, Halpern repeated calmly. Yes, capital preservation is essential. Overextension can compromise long-term security. One of the board members, Mrs. Alvarez, glanced toward me but said nothing. Halpern folded his hands. And under what authority are you conducting this reassessment? He asked. Daniel slid a copy of the limited power of attorney across the table. Temporary authority, he said. Medical and financial oversight. Halpern scanned it briefly. I see limitations, he observed. Standard safeguards, Daniel replied. Nothing obstructive. Halpern closed the document. Your father is present, he said evenly. And to my knowledge, competent. I'm thinking proactively, Daniel insisted. He's been hospitalized. That introduces variables. I am not a variable, I said quietly. The room stilled. Daniel turned toward me. Dad, this is exactly what I meant about planning. We need to streamline. The endowment structure here is generous. It was designed to be. Generosity is admirable, he said carefully. But it must be balanced. With what? I asked. With family responsibility there. It was. The board members exchanged subtle glances. Halpern reached for the black case and turned it slowly so it faced my son. Before, we discussed balancing generosity, he said. Perhaps we should address a recent transaction. Daniel's jaw tightened. I've already explained to my father, he said quickly. Those items were underutilized assets. Halpern opened the case. The medals caught the light without apology. They were sold under the description, estate clearance, Halpern said. including authenticated service documentation. Daniel shifted in his chair. I had authority to manage personal property. Conditional authority, Halpern corrected. Under incapacity. My father was hospitalized. I was not incapacitated, I said. Silence again. Halpern continued. Voice level. Our junior acquisitions member flagged the listing due to the name. I confirmed the service number personally. He looked directly at my son. I pinned this bronze star on your father myself. The words did not rise. They landed. Daniel blinked, caught between defensiveness and disbelief. You bought them, he said slowly. I did. Why? Because honor should not circulate as inventory. No one spoke. My son looked at me then, perhaps expecting anger, accusation, something louder. I offered neither. You didn't sell metal, I said quietly. You sold memory. His composure cracked, not dramatically, but enough. A tightening around the eyes. A calculation unraveling. I was protecting you, he insisted, though the confidence had thinned. From what? Mrs. Alvarez asked gently. Daniel hesitated. From instability, he answered. Halpern closed the case again. The Whitaker Fund, he said, is structured irrevocably. Your father endowed it with controlling interest retained during his lifetime. Amendments require his signature. Daniel looked at me sharply. You never told me that. You never asked, I replied. The room remained composed. No raised voices. No theatrics, just facts. And facts, when placed carefully, are heavier than accusations. No one rushed to fill the silence. Daniel's portfolio remained open in front of him. Charts and projections suddenly irrelevant against a closed black case. I acted in good faith, he said finally, though the firmness had left his voice. The house, the accounts, this foundation, everything is exposed if something happens unexpectedly. Exposure, I repeated. Is that how you see it? As risk, he corrected. I nodded slowly. Risk is measurable, I said. Character is not. He looked away first. Halpern slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward me. I recognized it immediately. A revocation form. I took the liberty of preparing this, he said, in case clarification was needed. Clarification, I read it once. It was concise, direct. It rescinded the temporary financial authority granted under the power of attorney, effective immediately, while preserving medical directives in the event of actual incapacity. Balanced, precise. Signed. The sound of pen against paper seemed louder than it should have been. Daniel straightened in his chair. You're revoking it? He asked. I'm refining it, I said calmly. Medical decisions remain protected. Financial control returns where it belongs. With you, he said. Yes, he exhaled slowly, hands flattening against the table. You're making this harder than it needs to be. No, I replied. I'm making it accurate, Mrs. Alvarez spoke gently. Mr. Whitaker, the Foundation's purpose is long established. Your father has never missed a meeting, even when he attended by speakerphone from a hospital bed. Daniel turned toward her. Surprised. I didn't realize he was that involved. That was intentional, I said. He looked at me again, searching now, not calculating, but trying to reconcile two versions of the same man. You think I was trying to take advantage, he said quietly. I think, I answered, choosing each word, that you were in a hurry to manage something you didn't fully understand. He absorbed that. And the medals? He asked after a moment. They will remain with the Foundation, I said, on permanent loan, displayed with context. Names included. You're donating them? His voice carried a trace of disbelief. I'm placing them where they can't be itemized. Halpern inclined his head slightly. An unspoken acknowledgement. Daniel's shoulders lowered. Not in defeat exactly, but in recognition. I transferred the funds from the sale into a holding account, he said. They haven't been touched. I know, I replied. You always did prefer clean ledgers. A faint, reluctant smile flickered across his face. It didn't last. What happens now? He asked. Now, I said evenly, you step back from Foundation matters. If in time you wish to understand its structure, you may attend as an observer, not an overseer. And the house? The house remains mine, he nodded once. And your estate? Is arranged. That answer settled heavily. The board members began gathering their materials quietly. The formal portion of the meeting concluded without declaration. As we stood, Daniel hesitated. "I didn't think you'd find out like this," he admitted. "I wasn't supposed to," I said. He didn't deny it. For a moment, we faced each other not as strategist and obstacle, but as father and son. "I thought I was being practical," he said. "Practicality without permission," I replied, "is presumption." He lowered his eyes. Halpern handed me the presentation case. The weight of it in my hands felt familiar. Not triumphant, not vindicated, simply restored. "We'll arrange the display," Halpern said quietly. "Thank you," I replied. Daniel walked with me to the elevator. The lobby felt different now, less like neutral ground. More like a threshold. "I didn't mean to disrespect you," he said as we waited. "I know," I answered. The doors opened. "But intent," I added gently, "doesn't erase action." We stepped inside together, and for the first time since the hospital, neither of us pretended this was about efficiency. The medals were installed 3 weeks later, not behind glass meant to glorify, but within a quiet alcove at the Whitaker Foundation headquarters. The display was understated. Matte charcoal backdrop, soft directional lighting, each medal mounted beside a small engraved plate, not just my name, all of them. Sergeant Luis Moreno. Corporal James Adler, Lieutenant Raymond Shaw, and others whose families had allowed their stories to be archived alongside mine over the years. At the bottom of the display, single line, "Honor is remembered together." I attended the installation alone. Halpern stood beside me for a moment, hands folded behind his back. "They belong here," he said. "Yes," I agreed. They always did. The house felt different after that. Not emptier, just clarified. Daniel did not visit for 2 weeks following the board meeting. I didn't call him either. Space, when chosen rather than imposed, can be instructive. When he finally came by, he didn't bring imported coffee or technology. He brought a small box of old photographs I hadn't seen in years. "I found these in the attic," he said. "Mom had them stored away." We sat at the kitchen table and went through them slowly. There was one of him at 8 years old, sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, staring up at me while I held one of the medals in my hand. His expression was open then, curious. "I used to think they made you invincible," he said quietly. "They didn't," I replied. "They just meant I survived," he nodded. "I didn't understand what they cost," he added. "Most people don't." He looked at me then, not as a portfolio to be stabilized, not as an aging variable to be managed, but as a man whose history extended beyond spreadsheets. "I was scared," he admitted after a while. "Of what?" "That you'd decline suddenly, that I'd be unprepared, that everything would unravel because I hesitated." I considered that carefully. "Preparation isn't wrong," I said, "but it must begin with conversation, not assumption." He absorbed that in silence. "I should have asked," he said. "Yes, and I shouldn't have sold them." "No," I agreed. There was no need to expand on that. Regret, when genuine, doesn't require embellishment. Over the following months, Daniel attended 2 foundation meetings as an observer. He didn't speak much. He listened. He asked questions afterward, not about liquidation, but about scholarship selection criteria and veteran housing initiatives. He visited the medal display once. I watched from a distance as he stood before it. He didn't touch the glass, he just read the names. The power of attorney was rewritten again. Later that year, this time with clearer boundaries and shared oversight, between Daniel and the Foundation's legal counsel in strictly defined circumstances, not because I no longer trusted him, but because trust functions best within structure. The house remains mine. The mornings are the same. Coffee in Margaret's blue mug. Newspaper folded precisely. The walks continue. The neighbors still wave. What changed is less visible. Daniel calls now before making plans that affect me. He asks. Sometimes I say no. Sometimes I say yes. The difference matters. A few months ago, he brought his own son, my grandson, to the foundation. The boy stood in front of the medal display with the same wide-eyed curiosity Daniel once had. Did you win those? He asked me. I smiled. No, I said gently. They weren't won. What are they for? For doing what needed to be done, I replied. He considered that carefully, then looked back at the names etched into the metal plates. All of them? He asked. All of them. Daniel stood slightly behind him. Quiet. Later, as we walked back to the car, my grandson ran ahead toward the sidewalk. I'm glad you kept them, Daniel said. I didn't keep them, I corrected softly. I placed them. He glanced at me, understanding settling in. There's a difference between possession and stewardship, between inheritance and entitlement, between efficiency and respect. As men age, the world has a way of treating them like ledgers nearing closure, assets to be tallied, liabilities to be minimized. But a life is not a balance sheet. It is a record of decisions, made when no one was watching. My son believed he was protecting my future. What he didn't understand was that the future had already been structured, carefully, quietly, over decades of deliberate choices, not to exclude him, but to ensure that what mattered most could not be converted into convenience. The day the medals were installed, I ran my fingers lightly along the edge of the display case before leaving, not to claim them, just to acknowledge them. Metal tarnishes if neglected. Memory does too, but honor, real. Honor doesn't live in objects, it lives in conduct, and that cannot be sold.